The man who said it was sitting behind a large desk in a well-appointed office in Midtown Manhattan, and he said it the way men in well-appointed offices in Midtown Manhattan said many things in 1956, with the casual authority of someone who has never had to consider whether his casual authority might be wrong. He was a music industry executive. He had power over what got recorded and what got played and what got sold, and he exercised that power through the language of markets and demographics and commercial viability, which was the industry's preferred language for saying things that would have sounded different if said plainly. He told James Brown that his music was too black. Not those exact words, not precisely. The music industry in 1956 had its own vocabulary for this conversation, a vocabulary that was technical and financial on the surface, and that required very little excavation to find what was underneath. He spoke about crossover potential, about mainstream appeal, about the specific demographic composition of the audiences that controlled the purchasing patterns the radio stations and the venue booking networks had organized themselves around. He spoke about rawness, by which he meant the specific quality of James Brown's voice and performance, the screams, the grunts, the physical intensity that live audiences found overwhelming in the way that certain kinds of genuine emotion are overwhelming, as something that complicated the commercial picture. He spoke about the market, by which he meant white America, and about what the market was ready to accept, by which he meant what white America had decided it was comfortable with. James Brown sat across the desk and listened to all of this. He was 23 years old. He had come from Augusta, Georgia, with the specific kind of hunger that forms in people who have grown up with nothing and who have found, in the course of that growing up, a thing they can do that nothing about their circumstances can take from them. He had been performing since he was a teenager. He had been developing in the specific forge of the black music circuit in the American South an approach to performing that was his own, in the most literal sense, built from his own body, his own voice, his own relationship to rhythm, and to the specific physical truth of what it feels like to put everything you have into a song in front of people who are feeling it with you. He had not been taught this. It had emerged from him. It was, in the precise and irreducible sense, who he was. And the man behind the desk in Midtown Manhattan was telling him that who he was the problem. The meeting had come about through the kind of industry connection that was, in 1956, one of the few available channels through which a young black artist from the South could get in front of the people who controlled the infrastructure of popular music. James had been building momentum on the Chitlin Circuit, the network of black-owned venues across the South and the urban North that operated as a parallel music industry, complete and self-sustaining, that the mainstream white industry largely ignored until it became commercially profitable to pay attention. He had been refining his act in those venues with the relentlessness of someone who understands that preparation is the only variable entirely within your control. He had been getting responses from audiences that told him, in the unambiguous language of 1,200 people on their feet, that what he was doing worked. He had arrived in that office in Midtown Manhattan with the evidence of that work in his body and in his memory, and he had encountered the other kind of evidence, the evidence that what worked in one world could be used as a disqualification in another. The executive was specific about what he meant by too black. This is important. He was not speaking in vague cultural generalities. He was speaking about the mechanics of the radio industry as it existed in 1956, the way that radio stations structured their playlists around the demographics of their advertisers, the way that mainstream pop radio in that year operated as a closed system that filtered content based not on quality or artistic merit, but on the racial identity of the artist and the racial associations of the musical style. He was speaking about the way that the booking networks for major venues in that period worked, the formal and informal agreements between venue operators and booking agents that sorted performers into tiers based on the same criteria, with black artists from the soul and rhythm and blues tradition placed in a tier that simply did not have access to the stages and the radio and the commercial distribution infrastructure that would have made the difference between regional success and the kind of reach that James Brown could see clearly in his mind and could not yet see in front of him. He was speaking about a system, a real, operational, economically functioning system that had been built over decades and that was not, in 1956, under any particular pressure to change, because the people for whom the system was working had no interest in it changing, and the people for whom it was not working had, to that point, not found sufficient leverage to force it. James Brown sat across the desk from this man and heard all of this, translated through the industry's preferred language of markets and demographics. And then he stood up. He thanked the executive for his time. He went back to Georgia. What happened in his mind between the moment he stood up from that chair and the moment he arrived back in Augusta is not something that anyone witnessed, because he was alone on the bus, and he did not describe it publicly in any form until much later, and even then only obliquely. But the decisions that James Brown made in the years immediately following that meeting tell you something about what the thinking produced. They tell you that whatever he felt in the presence of that man's assessment, and he was a person capable of feeling things fully, of letting things land and register with the complete impact they deserved. He had, by the time he arrived back in Georgia, converted the feeling into a different kind of energy. Not the energy of defeat, not the energy of accommodation, the energy of someone who has been told that the door is locked and has decided to build a different building. He went back to the road, but before he did something that people who knew him in that period later described as one of the clearest examples of what distinguished James Brown from other artists who received the same assessment in the same or similar rooms. He did not spend time in the feeling. He acknowledged it. He was not a man who bypassed his own responses, who performed stoicism as a substitute for actually processing something. And then he moved through it to the other side, which was the place where decisions lived. And he made a decision that was not a reaction, and was not a consolation, and was not a repositioning. It was a direction. The direction was simple. If the system said his music was too black for the mainstream infrastructure, he was going to build his audience without the mainstream infrastructure. He was going to take what the system had told him was a limitation and treat it as a specification. He was going to make music that was exactly as black as he was, in venues that were organized around audiences who understood exactly what that meant. And he was going to build the kind of commercial power that the mainstream infrastructure would eventually not be able to dismiss, not because he had modified himself to fit their criteria, but because he had made their criteria irrelevant. This sounds straightforward when described in retrospect. It was not straightforward to execute. What it required, in the years immediately following that meeting in Midtown Manhattan, was a level of sustained effort and sustained belief in a vision that had no institutional support and no external validation from the infrastructure that the industry considered authoritative. It required performing in venues that the mainstream press did not cover, and on radio stations that the mainstream distribution networks did not supply, and building within that space something large enough to be undeniable on its own terms. He went back to the road. He went back to the venues that the mainstream industry had decided were beneath its attention. He performed with an intensity that his band members and his audiences found difficult to describe, except by saying that it exceeded anything they had seen before, which was saying something, because what they had seen before from James Brown was already beyond the usual standard of what a performer could produce in a single evening. He rehearsed his band to a level of precision that other band leaders considered excessive. He fined musicians for wrong notes and missed cues, not because he was cruel, but because he understood, with a clarity that came from having sat in that office in Midtown Manhattan, that excellence was not optional when the system had decided that your very existence on certain stages was a problem. Excellence was the argument. Undeniable, repeated, documented excellence was the only argument available to him, and he was going to make it every single night. He also understood something about the economics of the music industry that the executive in Midtown Manhattan had inadvertently clarified for him. The mainstream radio system that filtered out artists like James Brown was one infrastructure. It was not the only infrastructure. The Chitlin Circuit had its own economics, its own audience, its own word-of-mouth distribution system that operated through the specific and powerful networks of black community life in America. Juke joints, beauty parlors, church halls, community centers, the social fabric of communities that the mainstream industry had decided were not its target audience. James Brown understood that these communities were not a consolation prize. They were a foundation, and a foundation built solidly enough could support something that the people who controlled the other infrastructure would eventually be unable to ignore. He recorded, he performed, he released, he built his audience one venue at a time, in one city at a time, in the specific and unglamorous way that genuine commercial power is actually built, as opposed to the way it appears to arrive suddenly from the outside. His music went into jukeboxes in places that the radio stations had decided were not worth programming for. His records moved through distribution channels that the mainstream industry had not organized around and therefore had not gatekept. His name traveled through the black community networks with the specific velocity of something that people want to share because it has given them something real, not just entertainment. Not just music in the background, but the kind of experience that makes people feel that something they already knew about themselves has been confirmed and amplified and sent back to them in a form they could not have produced for themselves. By 1958, 2 years after the meeting in Midtown Manhattan, James Brown was selling out venues in cities across the South and the urban North that the mainstream booking networks had not bothered to organize. The people coming to those shows were not a secondary audience or a consolation prize. They were an audience with real economic power, real enthusiasm, and a word-of-mouth network that operated faster and more reliably than the radio playlists the mainstream industry used as its distribution mechanism. They were telling each other about James Brown. They were buying his records. They were driving distances to see him perform that the mainstream industry's models of consumer behavior had not predicted and could not account for. The thing about the mainstream industry's models in that period is that they were built on assumptions about which audiences mattered and which did not. And those assumptions were not based on economics. They were based on race. The industry had decided, through decades of practice and institutional habit, that the black American audience was a secondary market, useful for certain kinds of revenue generation, but not the market around which the primary infrastructure was organized. This decision was not made in any single meeting. It was accumulated in hundreds of meetings and thousands of individual decisions over a period of decades. And by 1956, it had the quality of received wisdom, the kind of thing that does not feel like a choice, because it has been a practice for so long. James Brown's commercial trajectory in the late 1950s was, among other things, a data argument against that received wisdom. The data was accumulating in cities and venues and jukeboxes and record sales figures that the mainstream industry was not tracking because it had decided not to look. But the numbers were there. By 1960, James Brown had a following that was, in absolute terms, larger than many of the artists the mainstream industry was promoting through the infrastructure it had decided was the only one that counted. By 1963, he had recorded a live album at the Apollo Theater, a recording made against the explicit advice of his label, which did not believe that a live album from a black artist performing at a black venue for a black audience was a commercially viable product that sold over 1 million copies and demonstrated, in terms that the industry could not dismiss because they were expressed in the language the industry itself used, that the audience the system had decided to exclude was an audience large enough to change the calculation entirely. The number that eventually attached itself to James Brown's commercial achievement, 50 million records, is a number that requires some translation to fully comprehend. Records sold is not the same as records shipped, and records sold is not the same as records counted. And in an industry in which the accounting has historically favored the label over the artist, the number associated with any given performer carries within it the compromises of that history. But the scale of it, whatever the precise methodology, represents an audience of a size that the executive in Midtown Manhattan in 1956 had told James Brown was not available to him. An audience that was, in fact, not only available, but waiting for the music that spoke to it in the language it recognized, that did not ask it to moderate its response or contain its feeling or pretend that what was happening in its body when the groove hit was something other than what it was. The executive who sat across that desk from James Brown in 1956 was not a unique figure. He was a representative of a system, and the system he represented produced the same assessment of the same kind of artist in meeting rooms across the industry, throughout that period and the periods that followed. The assessment was always expressed in the language of markets and commercial viability. The assessment always came down to the same thing, and the artists who received the assessment had broadly two available responses. They could modify what they were doing to fit what the system said the market would accept, or they could build something that the system had decided not to build for them. James Brown did not modify what he was doing. He built something, not alone. Nothing that large is built alone. And the story of what James Brown built is inseparable from the musicians who played with him, the audiences who gave him the response that constituted the argument, the community networks that carried his name and his records, the promoters who believed in what they saw before the mainstream infrastructure caught up. But he was the center of it. The specific thing that he did and refused to stop doing, regardless of what anyone in any office in Midtown Manhattan said it was too much of, was the foundation on which everything else was built. The word that executive used, the specific formulation, the diagnosis of too much, is worth examining for one moment before we leave this story, because it contains inside it the precise nature of what was being demanded. Too black means not enough of something else. It means that the thing you are is in excess of what the gatekeepers have decided can be accommodated. It means that the gatekeepers are using the word too as a polite replacement for the word stop. It means stop being what you are, or be it somewhere else, somewhere we don't have to look at it, or account for it, or let it exist on the same stages where we have decided the legitimate things happen. James Brown heard this, and then he went and sold 50 million records, being exactly what they told him was too much. Which is the whole story. Which is also not a story about the music industry specifically, or about race specifically, though it is both of those things. It is a story about what happens when a person who has found the thing they actually are, the uncompromised, unreduced, fully inhabited version of themselves, is told by a system that their thing doesn't fit. And about the specific and particular response of going away from that room and being the thing more fully, more precisely, and to a larger audience than the system had been willing to predict. James Brown was 23 years old when he sat in that office in Midtown Manhattan. He was 73 when he died, 50 years later, having spent every one of those years between being what he was told he was too much of. The executive who told him has not been remembered. His desk is gone, his office is gone. What has survived is what was built despite it. The 50 million records are the visible part of that survival, the commercial evidence, the number that the industry's own language is designed to recognize. But the survival runs deeper than the number. It runs into the music itself, which is still playing on speakers somewhere in the world at this exact moment, and into the artists who built on what James Brown built, and into the genres and the cultural forms that took his specific innovations as their foundation, and extended them in directions that he could not have predicted from that office in Midtown Manhattan in 1956. Hip-hop, electronic music, every form of popular music that puts rhythm at the center, that treats the body as the primary receiver of what music is doing, that understands the groove not as decoration, but as the load-bearing structure of the whole thing. All of it sits, in one way or another, on what James Brown built in the years after someone told him he was too much of what he was. The music is everywhere. The assessment is gone. If this story made you think about what you were told you were too much of and whether you believed it, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell us in the comments, has anyone ever told you that something fundamental about who you are was a problem? What did you do with that? We read every single one.